The grandfather clock in my parents' dining room had always been too loud. That night, it was the only sound, ticking against the silence like a fist on a locked door. I sat at the head of the table, which was the first wrong thing, because that seat belonged to my mother. She sat to my left, her jaw working on nothing, her pot roast growing cold between us. My father's hands were flat on the table, pressed down hard, the way you press down on something you're afraid will move. My sister Tatum's mascara had drawn 2 dark rivers below her eyes, and she hadn't wiped them. The tassel from my graduation cap brushed against my cheek every time I turned my head. On the table in front of me, a green composition notebook, open to a page covered in equations, and a stack of legal documents with the logo of a law firm none of them had ever heard of. 6 weeks earlier, I was nobody's daughter. Not in any way that counted. I had stopped being that a long time ago, back when the distance between my parents' house in Charlotte and my apartment in Seattle became more than geography. It became policy. My name is Joe Harwick, and I graduated from college 4 years before that dinner. Nobody came. The morning the licensing deal closed, Seattle was doing what Seattle does, which is rain sideways against windows that never fully dry. I had 3 monitors running, each displaying a different layer of the compression algorithm I'd spent 4 years refining. My apartment was the kind of place a person lives in when they spend most of their time inside their own head. 1 couch, 1 mug, a standing desk, and a shelf where things went to be ignored. On that shelf, tucked between a router manual and a box of backup drives, sat a shipping box I'd never opened. Inside, it was a graduation cap. My phone buzzed. Craig Ellison, VP of Infrastructure at Global Tech. I picked up on the second ring. Joe, it's done. Legal signed off this morning. $5 million a month. Exclusive license. 3-year minimum with renewal options. You built something nobody else could build. Congratulations. I said thank you. I set the phone on the desk. The rain kept hitting the window. $60 million a year. More than my parents' house was worth, 60 times over. $14.8 million. Already sitting in a brokerage account from the advance payment and the pilot program. My mother once told me I wouldn't amount to anything more than a secretary. The brokerage statement disagreed. I had no one to call. That last part wasn't entirely true. I called Rena. Rena Cates had been my college roommate at a time when I could barely get through a paragraph without the letters rearranging themselves on the page. She'd read my textbooks aloud while I coded, her voice carrying through our dorm room at midnight, translating words my brain kept scrambling into sequences my ears could hold. In exchange, I'd helped her survive statistics. She was a startup attorney now, sharp and careful, and the closest thing I had to family that didn't share my last name. $5 million a month, she said, and I could hear her chair squeak as she leaned back. Joe, do you understand what this means? It means my infrastructure compression protocol is going to handle data routing for 23% of North American internet traffic. It means you're rich. Say the other thing. I'm rich. Now tell your parents. The apartment went quiet except for the rain. I picked up my coffee. It was cold. It had been cold for 2 hours. They wouldn't understand what it means, I said. Or you're afraid they still won't care. Rena had a talent for finding the load-bearing sentence in any conversation and saying it aloud before anyone was ready for the wait. I changed the subject. She let me. That was the other thing Rena was good at, knowing when to push and when to step back and let the silence do its work. I hadn't spoken to my parents in 8 months. The last contact was a text from my mother in January. Tatum got the Deloitte partnership. Thought you'd want to know. I'd stared at it for 30 seconds, typed and deleted 3 responses, and then put my phone in a drawer. By September, the drawer had become a metaphor I was too tired to unpack. To understand the dinner, you need to understand the graduation. 4 years before the licensing deal, I drove 3 hours south from my apartment to the State University campus where I'd just finished a computer science degree. It had taken me 6 years to earn it, because I'd worked full-time the entire way through, writing code for a logistics company during the day and taking night classes that ended at 10 p.m. Driving home in the dark with my eyes burning from screen fatigue and my mind still parsing the lecture notes I'd recorded, because reading them would have taken 3 times as long, 6 years for a 4-year degree. I was 24, and I was proud of myself in a way I didn't have vocabulary for, which was fitting, given that vocabulary had always been the part of language that worked against me. I saved 2 seats, row 14, left side, near the aisle so my father wouldn't have to squeeze past anyone with his bad knee. I'd told my mother the date 3 times. I'd texted the details. I'd emailed the parking map with the handicap accessible entrance, highlighted in yellow, because my father would never ask for accommodation, but would appreciate not having to walk across a gravel lot. The ceremony started at 10. By 10:15, the seats were still empty. By 10:30, a woman I didn't know sat down in one of them and smiled at me apologetically. I smiled back. I sat through the rest of the ceremony, with my hands folded in my lap and my phone on silent, because I didn't want to see the screen. When my name was called, I walked across the stage with the same expression I'd been wearing since I was 8 years old, pleasant, contained, a face designed to give nothing away. The applause was polite, generic, the sound of strangers clapping for someone they'd forget by the next name. Afterward, I stood in the parking lot in the heat, my gown damp with sweat and the cap still on my head, and called my mother. She picked up on the 4th ring. I could hear silverware in the background, voices, Tatum laughing at something that sounded like it came from a world running on a completely different clock. "We're at Tatum's anniversary brunch," my mother said. "You know how it is." "I graduated today, Mom." A pause. The silverware sound got quieter, like she'd walked into another room. When she spoke again, her voice had the careful modulation she used when she was explaining something she considered obvious. "Honey, it's a state school degree. Tatum has her Duke MBA. Let's not make it a bigger deal than it is." I sat in my car for 45 minutes after that call. The campus emptied around me. Families with balloons walked past, laughing, taking photos in front of the fountain. A girl in a white dress ran to her father, and he lifted her off the ground. The cap went back in its box. The box went on the shelf when I got home. It never moved again, not for 4 years, until the night I opened it in a hotel room in Charlotte, and the cardboard crackled like something waking up. The phone call that changed the sequence of events came on a Tuesday in September. A technology journalist at a mid-tier publication wrote an article about Global Tech's new licensing deal. The deal itself was news. What made it unusual was that the licensee was a single individual, not a company or a university lab. The journalist found my name, my photo from a conference panel 2 years ago, where I was standing behind a podium with my hands in my pockets because I still didn't know what to do with them during presentations. The article included the contract value. It went moderately viral in tech circles, which meant it bled into LinkedIn, which meant it bled into general news feeds, which meant that by Wednesday afternoon, my mother had seen it. My phone rang, which made my blood run cold from the one person in the family who never gets involved in drama. That's when I realized my mother's voice wasn't just about being uninvited. They didn't just exclude me, they turned me into the villain. Behind my back, they told the whole family that I refused to come, that I was bitter, unstable, jealous, and they even told the groom's family I threatened to ruin the wedding. But they made one fatal mistake. The wedding contract, the venue, the flight. I live in Seattle, Mom. Thursday then. Friday at the latest. This is important, Joe. Family. She said the word family, the way some people say please, as if it were a key that could open any lock. In my experience, the locks it opened tended to lead to rooms where I was expected to pay for something. "I'll think about it," I said. "Don't think too long. Tatum is coming. We're all getting together. Like old times." Old times. When old times meant me cooking in the kitchen while Tatum opened presents in the living room. When old times meant Christmases, where my gifts were practical and Tatum's were aspirational. When old times meant the photo wall growing taller with Tatum's accomplishments and my section of the wall remaining blank, a patch of beige paint that matched the rest of the house so perfectly, no one would ever guess something was missing. I booked a flight that night. but not before calling Rena. "When was the last time your mother called you without wanting something?" Rena asked. I scrolled back through my call history, going month by month through the void. The answer was never. Every call in the last decade had a request embedded in it, like a hook inside bait. "Come to Tatum's birthday. Bring a dish for Easter. Could you send money for the furnace repair?" Because Tatum's husband was between jobs. Never just to talk. Never a Tuesday evening call that began with, "How are you?" and meant it. "She saw the article," I said. "Of course she did. I want to go." Rena was quiet for 3 seconds. Then go. But go as the person who built that algorithm, not as the girl who sat in the parking lot. After we hung up, I walked to the shelf and picked up the shipping box. The tape was old and crackled when I pulled it. Inside, the cap was dark blue, a little dusty, the tassel still crisp from never being touched. I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. The way you look at something you've been carrying without holding, an object that weighs nothing in your hands but has been heavy in your chest for 4 years. The next morning, I was in Rena's office, and she was already in lawyer mode. She had a yellow legal pad covered in questions and a pen she kept clicking against her teeth. "Let's talk about your exposure. Who has knowledge of your financial situation?" "You, my accountant, Craig, at Global Tech. Now, apparently, the internet. Your parents have 0 legal claim to your income. You're 28, unmarried, no dependents. Your assets are in your name only. Your company is a single-member LLC. But I want to be careful." She pulled a template from her drawer. "Standard NDA. If they want to be involved in your financial life in any capacity, they sign this first. It protects you from verbal agreements, implied promises, and anyone who later claims a dinner conversation constituted a contract." She slid the document across her desk. I put it in my bag without reading it. It seemed like overkill at the time, like bringing an umbrella to a desert. "One more thing," Rena said, and her voice shifted into the lower register she reserved for findings she expected me to react to. "Your sister's consulting firm."
And I would finally learn when she opened waiting.
I pulled the public filings this morning.
If you've ever read a message
no
from someone,
revenue
my
in
father
recent
was
months.
looking to love you and
2
felt your whole
employees
spine
resigned.
turning to a
And
stranger.
there's a $340K line
You'll
item
want
in
to
your
be
family's
here
trust
for what
record
they didn't know.
that
This
maps
was
to a
given to
series
Mom
of
to
ordered
understand
transfers.
why my grand
She turned her
2020
laptop
sapphire
to
ring
face
by
it.
Sophia Donovan.
Your parents have been funding
and
Tatum's
donor
business for
appreciation
2
month.
years.
Singer's sewing machine was in the hands of a paralegal
Mom
from
kept
Green
from
in
the
her
Harwick
dresser
family
drawer.
trust.
You have to understand what kind of woman under the silk scarf.
Tatum's rough patch had cost more than my entire college education, including the 2 extra years of night school, the student loans I'd paid off by writing code at 4 a.m., and every meal I'd skipped because textbooks cost more than groceries. I put that number in my pocket the same way I filed most data, silently, cleanly, for retrieval when the conditions required it. While packing for the flight to Charlotte, I found the green composition notebook in a box of old things I'd been meaning to throw away for 3 apartment moves and 2 time zones. The cover was soft from years of handling, the wire spine bent at an angle that suggested devotion or damage, depending on your reading. Inside, equations, diagrams, flowcharts drawn in pencil, and on the first page, in handwriting that wasn't mine, an inscription. My father's handwriting, small and quick, for Joe, who sees things differently. He'd given me that notebook when I was 12. By then, my parents had decided I was the slow one. The evidence was consistent and damning by their standards. I couldn't read aloud without stumbling, couldn't spell basic words consistently, couldn't keep up with Tatum, who'd been reading chapter books at 6 and writing essays by 8. Nobody used the word dyslexia until a college advisor suggested testing when I was 20. By then, my mother had already written the official family narrative. Tatum was the smart one. Joe was the other one. The narrative was clean, efficient, and completely wrong, but correcting it would have required the kind of attention my parents reserved exclusively for their firstborn. But my father, on Saturday mornings, would drive me to a diner on Breckenridge Street and set up his old laptop on a table near the window where the light was best. He taught me BASIC, then Python, then the fundamentals of data structures. He never explained why. He never framed it as compensation or therapy or remediation. He just showed up every Saturday with the laptop and 2 orders of scrambled eggs and a patience he never displayed at any other time during the week. The notebook was for writing down the ideas I couldn't say out loud, the ones that moved too fast for my mouth to catch. Every line of my compression algorithm started in that notebook. Every one. Rena was on FaceTime when I held it up. "What's that?" she asked, leaning forward. I told her. "Is there a single photo of you in that house?" she asked. I set the notebook down carefully, the way you set down something that might break if it hit the wrong surface. No. Rena's expression changed, just for a second. A tightening around her eyes that surfaced whenever our conversations brushed up against the thing she carried. Her family hadn't spoken to her in 6 years, not since she chose law school over running the family restaurant in Paterson, New Jersey. Her mother still made sauce on Sundays. Rena still smelled tomatoes in her sleep sometimes. "At least you're going," she said. I couldn't. Charlotte in October smelled the same as it always had. Magnolias past their peak, warm asphalt, the faint sweetness of someone's dryer sheets through a screen door. The air was thick enough to chew. I rented a car at the airport and drove past my parents' house without stopping. Through the front window, visible even from the street, was the photo wall. I could have drawn it from memory. Tatum's Duke diploma, centered at eye level. Her wedding portrait, below it and to the right, featuring a husband in a surgeon's coat. And a smile so white it looked backlit. Her marathon medal in a shadow box. A family photo from some Christmas where everyone was wearing matching sweaters, including me, though I was at the edge of the frame, half cropped by the border. My face partially obscured by a door frame the photographer hadn't bothered
Lily
to adjust
Hensel,
for.
call this
Nothing
a child
else of
holding
mine.
the hand of a
For
woman
14
in 2
not a
days.
report
I had
card,
not been
not
both
a
of them
graduation
looking at each
photo,
other. 14 days
not even
I
a
had been
mention.
the daughter who still
The
held
whole
her
told the
mother's
stories
letter.
my mother had
True.
chosen to
For
tell.
when you
My
graduated,
mother had
I was
just
not a
answered
character
the
in
question
it.
for
Age
me. I
9.
drove to the
I
block
set the
where the
alarm.
diner
I
on
took a
Breckenridge
photograph
used
of
to
it
be.
where it lay.
It was a
Tomorrow I
nail
would drive
salon.
100 miles
The
south
building's
on
face
I-3
rearranged
original
into
in the
something
small office on
unrecognizable.
Augusta Road in Green.
The
I went
window where my
downstairs.
father and I
I
used
would
to
meet
sit,
a woman, my
replaced by a
grandmother,
neon
sitting
sign
across from
advertising
Juliet
job
had been
announced.
notified by the
The
Yale
booth
committee
had
on
been right away.
corner. My father
Ethan just
clock
sat
that
there for a
ran
while,
7 minutes
phone
past
face
three.
down on the table.
My father would have
letting
heard
the
us
silence in his
set up the
apartment
laptop
stretch
right
as far as it
Sunday
needed
night.
to.
Scrambled
The
eggs
stillness
waiting by the
wasn't
time I slid
uncomfortable.
into the seat
He was
across
used
from
to
me.
it.
So
He
proud.
had lived most of his life
She
in
let
that
it sit on
same
the
quiet
screen for
space
10
3
minutes.
hours every Saturday. At
She
least
did not
even when
have
the
his
rooms
complete
around him were
attention.
full of
She did not
people
need
who
to.
shared his
Which was a
last
resource
name.
so rare in that
That
house
message
that
from
we
his
know.
dad
That
was
I
a
kept
ripple,
then Annabelle
but
plays
not
it
yet a
was
wave, the way a
Not
scientist
yet. My
documents.
grandmother's voice
Ethan
came
had
out of the
learned
conference
early
room speaker
that
coffee
being
shop
quiet
room
was
the way it had
easier than
outdoor
being
dining.
eating, and reasonable Wi-Fi. I sat under an awning and opened my laptop, pulling up the public filings for Harwick Strategic Consulting, LLC. The numbers confirmed what Rena had found, with additional detail that made the picture sharper and uglier. 12 quarterly transfers from the Harwick Family Trust, averaging $28,300 each, totaling $339,600 over 24 months. The trust had been established by my grandfather, Edwin Harwick, a man who'd run a printing company for 40 years, and put the proceeds into a trust designated for the education and advancement of Harwick descendants. My education, my advancement, had never drawn a single cent from that fund. Not when I was working the night shift at a logistics company to pay tuition. Not when I was eating ramen 3 meals a day during my 5th year of college because my textbook costs exceeded my grocery budget.
Every email
Not
she
when I
had ever
asked my
sent all
mother
this time
once
same way. I
if
thought
there was
you had
any
Lily.
family money that might help
I
us
stayed
through.
on the phone with her
And she
for
said,
45 minutes.
"That's Tatum's
We're
college
prepared to
fund.
give her back what your grandmother
Tatum
left
is
for
the
you.
one
I
with
told
the
her about the
academic
Yale
future.
committee after you cut
6
about
years of
Juliet's
night school
essay.
and
Face us in
overtime,
about the
4
letter
a.m.
Milo
apology
apologized on
sessions.
video.
And
3
the
months.
trust
She
my
listened,
grandfather
but that was
set
how
up to
long
help
my grandmother
descendants
had
like
been at
me
the end.
had been
She said,
siphoned to keep
I
Tatum's
What do you
business
need me to do?
alive,
41
while it
books. I
produced
told her I
zero
would call her.
revenue
I read them
and
once
shed
the way
employees.
there was something I had to do
The
for a
irony
patient
was
you don't know
structural.
yet. Evening of
The
March.
money designated for education had funded a company that was failing because its founder had been educated beyond her competence by a system that valued credentials over capability. Tatum had the Duke MBA. I had the algorithm. The trust had funded the wrong investment. The coffee I ordered sat untouched until it was cold. I stared at the numbers on my screen and ran the math the way I ran all math, automatically, compulsively. $339,600. Divided by the $4,200 I'd earned per month during my 6 years of night school, that was 81 months of my income. Almost 7 years of my labor spent on Tatum's rough patch. I closed the laptop and watched the traffic pass on Breckenridge for a while, the nail salon glowing pink in the fading light where the diner used to glow yellow. That evening, in my hotel room, my phone rang. The caller ID said Dad. Joe. His voice was low, the way it got when he was calling from the garage, where Gretchen couldn't hear him over the sound of whatever project he was pretending to work on. I saw the article, "I wanted to call you myself. Before tomorrow." Okay. I always knew you were smart, Joe. I always knew. My chest did something complicated. A tightening that could have been anger or gratitude, and the fact that I couldn't separate the two was its own kind of data, the kind that breaks clean models. This was what I'd been waiting for. This exact sentence. From this exact person, 8 words, and every one of them landed precisely where they were aimed. Tomorrow's meeting, he continued, and the warmth in his voice recalibrated slightly, picking up a note of purpose that hadn't been there a moment ago. Your mother has some ideas about how you could help Tatum's business. She's been stressed about it. I think if you heard the plan, it could bring the family together. It could be good for everyone. The tightening in my chest released, but not in the direction of relief. He wasn't calling to acknowledge me. He was softening the runway so Gretchen's plane could land without turbulence. The warmth in his voice was genuine, which made it worse, because genuine warmth deployed in service of someone else's agenda is a specific kind of betrayal that doesn't have a clean name. "I'll be there," I said and hung up. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked at my bag, where the NDA sat in its folder. The reason Rena had insisted on it was no longer abstract. It was sitting in my call log, wearing my father's voice. I texted Rena, "Wade called. He's running advance ops for Gretchen. The meeting is about Tatum's company." She replied in 12 seconds. "Obviously. Are you still going?" "Yes." "Then remember, you don't owe them a performance. You owe yourself the truth. Everything else is optional." I set the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. The hotel room was beige, in the way all hotel rooms are beige, aggressively neutral, a space designed to belong to no one. I had spent most of my life in spaces like that, rooms that were temporary by design, apartments I never decorated, because decorating implied permanence, and permanence implied believing I deserved to stay somewhere. My Seattle apartment had a standing desk, 1 mug, and a shelf full of things I was ignoring. This hotel room had the same energy, just with better sheets. The green notebook sat on the desk. I opened it to a random page and found a diagram I'd drawn at 14, a rudimentary flowchart for sorting data by category. The arrows were uneven, the boxes lopsided, and in the margin I'd written a note to myself in capital letters. Make it faster. 14 years old, sitting in a diner booth with scrambled eggs, trying to make something faster. The compression algorithm that global tech was paying $60 million a year for started with that impulse. Make it faster, make it smaller, keep only what matters, discard the rest. My entire methodology was born from a 12-year-old's need to reduce the noise so the signal could get through. Dyslexia had taught me that. My father's patience had given me the tools. My mother's dismissal had provided the fuel. The next morning, my phone rang at 7. "Tatum, Mom told me about your deal." Her voice was strained, the specific strain of someone who has been coached in vulnerability. "I'm happy for you, Joe. I really am. But I need to ask you something." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and waited. The air conditioner hummed its flat, neutral hum, the sound of a machine that doesn't care what happens in the room it's cooling. "My firm is going through a rough patch. Mom and Dad have been helping, but they're tapped out. 340,000 in, and the runway is still short." She paused, and I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow, the respiratory signature of a rehearsed confession. If you could invest, not give, invest, it would change everything for us. You could be a partner. 40% equity, 40% of what? Your public filings show no revenue in 9 months. Silence. Then, you pulled my filings? They're public. Tatum. Another silence, longer this time. And when she spoke again, the coaching was gone, and something raw was showing through. You owe this family, Joe. We supported you. We let you live in the basement, while you did your little computer thing. That's 2 years of rent you never paid. My little computer thing. The phrase arrived with the precision of a quoted text, something lifted directly from our mother's vocabulary and placed in Tatum's mouth like a borrowed tool. Tatum was reading from Gretchen's script. The question was whether she heard herself doing it. Is there anything else? I asked. I have a business plan ready. Mom helped me put it together. I can email it before the meeting so you can review the numbers. Don't bother, I said, and she hung up first, which confirmed that the conversation had not gone according to the outline Gretchen had provided. I called Rena. She picked up before the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call or hadn't put her phone down since last night. Both were plausible. The meeting is a shakedown, I said. I know. I found something else this morning. Her voice carried a professional flatness, the controlled register she used when delivering findings she expected to land hard. Your mother's Facebook. She posted the article about your deal yesterday. The caption reads, "So proud of my brilliant daughter. The apple doesn't fall far." 47 likes. Your Aunt Carol commented, "You must be so proud, Gretchen." Your mother replied, "We always knew she'd do great things. We always knew she'd do great things." From a woman who had called my graduation a waste of time. From a woman who hadn't dialed my number in 8 months. From a woman who had funded Tatum's failing company to the tune of $340K from a trust that carried my grandfather's name while I worked double shifts to pay tuition she never once offered to cover. I didn't say anything for a while. Rena stayed on the line. I walked into the bathroom and sat on the floor. The tiles were cold through my jeans. 17 white tiles, 3 cracked, 1 with a chip the shape of a comma. I counted them because counting was what I did when the world stopped making sense, when the data inputs were so contradictory that no algorithm could reconcile them into a coherent model. My hands were shaking, and the shaking had nothing to do with temperature. It was structural, as if the framework I'd built my entire competence on was vibrating at a frequency it wasn't designed for. The graduation cap sat on the bathroom counter where I'd left it that morning, the tassel hanging over the edge, perfectly still. I reached up and pulled it onto my lap, holding it against my chest with both hands, the cardboard warm from the counter and the fabric rough against my palms. My breathing went shallow, then fast, too fast for the amount of oxygen the room contained. 2 empty seats in row 14, left side, near the aisle. The sound of silverware through a phone speaker, while Tatum laughed in a room I wasn't in. Let's not make it a bigger deal than it is. And 47 likes on a Facebook post from a woman who had never once, in 28 years, posted a single photograph of me. The air conditioning unit clicked on. Cold air moved across my wet face, finding the tracks before I registered that anything had fallen. I pressed my palms against the tile floor, feeling the grout lines under my fingertips like the seams of something that had been assembled from pieces that almost, but didn't quite, fit together. I stood up. Not because the moment was over, because standing was the next thing in the sequence, and I had always been better at executing the next step than at processing the current one. Rena was still on the line. "I'm here," she said. Nothing else. The best thing anyone had said to me in months, and it was 2 words from a woman who wasn't even related to me. "I'm going to the meeting," I said. "I know you are." That night, I lay on the hotel bed, with the green notebook open beside me. The ceiling was textured in that way. Hotel ceilings always are, like someone pressed a sponge against it 1,000 times and called it design. My father's handwriting on the inside cover. For Joe, who sees things differently. I traced the letters with my index finger, the ink slightly raised from the pressure of his pen. He had written it quickly, without ceremony, the way he did everything kind, in private, in the margins, where Gretchen couldn't see it or criticize it or take credit for it. The truth I'd been running from was not complicated. It was just heavy. I hadn't built the compression algorithm to solve a technical problem,
I left
though
the
it
cafe
did solve
with
one with a
everything I
precision
needed.
that made senior
That weekend,
engineers at
on
Global
April
Tech
4th, my
reconsider
mother
their
get on your
assumptions
knees and
about
beg,
daily
you
food.
ungrateful bitch.
I
Come
built
home
it to
Sunday.
prove I was
Maybe
not
then
stupid.
we'll return your
Every
grandmother's.
variable
This has
was a
gotten out of
rebuttal.
hand.
Every
Everything here is
function was a
ours now.
paragraph.
I did
I
not go
couldn't
for
write
come
in the
apologize
language
on
everyone
she
else
opened the
used.
door with her arms
My
family.
entire career,
I read both
my
messages
company,
once.
my $60
Elizabeth,
million
then I read them
licensing
again.
contract.
Fix this. Then
All of
I
it was
read
a
them a third
response to a
time
sentence
because
my
I
mother
needed
said
to
when I was
understand
8
that
years
the
old
woman who had taught
and couldn't
7-year-old
read
has
the word
about the future
February
story
out
of the
loud
world.
in front of her book club. Maybe Joe just isn't meant for school. My father hadn't corrected her. He'd given me a notebook instead. A private language to replace the public one that kept betraying me. And here I was, a decade and a half later, about to walk into their dining room with legal documents and financial records and a hat I'd never worn, asking them to acknowledge what I had built with the language they gave me by accident. I turned on my side, the notebook's wire spine pressed against my forearm. Even if they said the words, even if Gretchen looked me in the eye and said, "We were wrong, Joe, you're brilliant, you matter," it would not fill the space. Because the space was not shaped like their approval. It was shaped like 10 years of silence. A decade of empty seats and unanswered texts and holidays spent in a Seattle apartment watching the rain make patterns on glass, while Tatum's achievements climbed the photo wall, and mine went unrecorded. No single sentence could compress that much absence into something small enough to carry. I was an expert in compression. This was beyond the algorithm. I was still going to the meeting, not for their approval, not for revenge. I was going because the truth was sitting in my bag and on my laptop and in the notebook beside me, and it deserved to exist in the same room as the people who had pretended it didn't. I would tell them what I'd found, about the money, about the Facebook post, about the graduation and the basement and Tatum's firm, and the trust fund that had never funded anyone's trust except Tatum's. And then I would leave. Not with a slam, with a fact. I sat up, picked up the graduation cap from the bathroom counter, and set it on my head. In the hotel mirror, I looked like exactly what I was. A woman who had graduated 4 years ago, attended by nobody, and was finally ready to wear the evidence. The drive from the hotel to my parents' house took 22 minutes through streets I could have navigated with my eyes closed. The magnolias were losing their last petals, the sidewalks dusted in brown. The green notebook sat in my bag on the back seat. The NDA was in a folder on the passenger seat. The graduation cap was on my head, and I left it there when I got out of the car, walked up the 3 front steps, with the cracked second riser that my father had been meaning to fix for 8 years, and rang the doorbell of a house that had never quite been mine. Gretchen opened the door. Her eyes went to the cap immediately, and something moved across her face, fast, like a shadow on water. Confusion first, then a flicker I could not categorize, and then the smile, the hostess smile, the one she used for neighbors and real estate agents, and anyone she needed to manage into a particular impression. "What is that on your head?" "My graduation cap." From 4 years ago. Nobody was there to see it, so I figured I'd wear it today. Wade appeared in the hallway behind her. He saw the cap and stopped walking. His left hand went to the doorframe the way it used to go to the steering wheel on Saturday mornings, gripping something solid while something complicated passed through him. "Come in," Gretchen said, stepping aside with a practiced pivot that put her between me and the photo wall,
drug-free
though not quite
workplace,
quickly enough.
random
I saw it as
testing
I
in
passed.
effect.
Tatum's
I
Duke
had
diploma,
passed my December
her wedding
screen 3
portrait,
weeks earlier.
her marathon
I
medal,
called my old
the
church
Christmas
friend
photo with
Bethany
my
on
face
speakerphone
half cropped at the
and
edge.
asked her
The wall was a
gently
sentence
what
my mother
people
had been
were
writing
saying.
for 30 years,
She
and I
paused
was
for a
not in
long
the grammar.
time.
The
She
dining room
said,
table was set for
"Patty
4.
says you've been
Pot
struggling
roast in
with
the center.
substances and toxic
Because Gretchen
influences."
always made pot roast
She
when
says
she
they've
wanted
had to
the
set
room to
hard
feel
boundaries
warm
to
and
protect
familiar,
Mama.
the way a set designer
Substances
chooses props
and toxic
before the
influence.
curtain goes up. Tatum sat at her usual place, hands folded around a glass of water, her nails bitten to the quick. She looked tired in a way that makeup couldn't solve, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a version of yourself that's too heavy for the frame. Gretchen sat down and started before Wade had finished pulling out his chair, which told me the agenda was tight and the timeline was hers. Well, we're all together now, and that's what matters. She reached under the table and produced a printed document, spiral-bound, with Harwick Strategic. Growth investment proposal on the cover in the same font Tatum's old consulting website used. She slid it across the table toward me with both hands, a gesture that was simultaneously offering an instruction. Tatum's firm needs a $200K investment to stabilize and restructure. It's a family matter, Joe. Family helps family. The prospectus sat between us like a small,
Then I
well-dressed
noticed the
ultimatum.
woman standing 2
I
feet
let it stay
behind
there.
Patty.
I opened my
Light blue
folder
scrubs.
and placed the NDA
Name
on the
tag
table
Brenda Markham,
next to Gretchen's
RN.
prospectus.
I
The two
didn't
documents
recognize
lay
her from
side
this
by
floor.
side,
She
two
wasn't a
versions
circulating
of the
nurse.
same conversation,
She wasn't a charge
pointing
nurse,
in opposite
but she
directions.
had a notary stamp in her
Before
hand.
we talk about
A
family
lot of
investments,
South Carolina nurses
I said
pick
I'd
up
like
a notary
everyone to
commission
sign
for
this.
$50
Gretchen
of
looked at
side
the
income.
document without reaching for
Patty
it.
had clearly
Her reading
arranged it ahead of
glasses
time.
were on a chain around her
She
neck,
had been waiting for the
and
morphine.
she kept them there, as if putting them on would mean taking the document seriously. What is this? A non-disclosure agreement, standard for anyone who wants involvement in my financial life. We're your parents, Joe, not business partners. You haven't been my parents in 10 years. The grandfather clock filled the silence. Gretchen's nostrils flared once, a micro-expression she had never been able to control, the same tell that preceded every counterattack I'd ever witnessed at this table. Everything you have, she said, her voice lower now, recalibrated to the pitch of authority she used when she expected the room to agree. You have because of this family. We fed you. We housed you. We gave you every opportunity. You let me sleep in the basement for 2 years, while I built a compression algorithm that's now licensed to the largest technology company on this continent. $60 million a year. And you called it my little computer thing. More than once. Tatum repeated it to me on the phone yesterday, so the phrase is alive and well in this house. I never said that. Her chin lifted. Her eyes were dry and sharp and completely certain, the eyes of a woman who has edited her own memory so thoroughly that the original draft no longer exists. You said it at Thanksgiving 5 years ago, when Uncle Paul asked what I did for work. You said it again when I told you I was starting my own company. Tatum said it to me on the phone yesterday morning, which means it's still in rotation. I kept my voice level, the same pitch I used in technical presentations, where the data does the work and the delivery just holds the door open. The phrase belongs to this house, Mom. Denying it doesn't delete it from the record. Tatum flinched. Wade's gaze dropped to the table. Gretchen's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Her jaw performing the mechanical function of speech without producing sound, a buffer overflow of responses competing for the same output channel. I have the financial records for Tatum's consulting firm, I continued. $340,000 from the Harwick Family Trust over 24 months, 12 transfers. Grandpa's trust, the one designated for education and advancement of Harwick descendants. I advanced myself through 6 years of night school on my own wages. My advancement cost this trust nothing. Tatum's advancement cost $340K and counting, which is more than my entire college education. Tatum put her head in her hands. Not a performance. Just the motion of someone too tired to hold her head up anymore. Her fingers pressed into her temples, and between them I could see her mouth moving, though no words came out, as if she were counting something only she could hear. That money was for all of us, Tatum said into her palms. Mom said it was flexible. It was flexible enough to cover your failed business for 2 years. It was not flexible enough to buy me a single textbook. Gretchen's face went white, then red, the color moving through her skin, the way weather moves through a valley, fast and without permission. Her hands pressed flat on the table, mirroring Wade's posture from the opening minutes. And for the first time all evening, she and her husband looked like they were doing the same thing. You have no right to access those records. They're public filings, Mom. The trust reports to the state of North Carolina annually. Anyone can pull them. This is not what this meeting was supposed to be. No. It was supposed to be me writing a check, the way it's always been, except now the amount has more zeros. I turned to Wade. He was sitting very still, as he had sat during every confrontation in this house for as long as I could remember. Hands flat, mouth closed, eyes on the table, the
3
posture
years
of a
old.
man
I
who
have
had spent
seen
30
ever been
years
called
choosing
crazy.
quiet
This is
over
among the
truth
cleanest
while
contracts
calling it
I have
peace.
ever
I
comment
took
from
the
our
green
scribes.
notebook from my bag
What
and
happened
placed
next?
it on the table
Destroyed
between us.
everything they thought
Opened
they
it to the
owned.
first
5
page.
hours. The email
His
came in
handwriting.
at
For
9:38.
Joe,
That was
he
the
sees things
entirety of the
differently.
relationship
You
my
gave me
sister
this
had
when I
claimed.
was 12,
I was in the
he
break
said.
room at Prisma.
He drove me to the diner on Breckenridge
halfway
every
through
Saturday
styrofoam
for 3
9
years
bad coffee.
and taught
He
me to
spoke
code
still in
on
name
scrolls and
usual
Shiva.
14-hour
Basic
ICU
first,
shift.
then
Ms.
Python,
Bellamy. My
then how
fingernails
data
were
structures
stained.
work. You ordered scrambled eggs and never once explained why you were doing it. You just showed up. My voice was doing something I hadn't authorized, getting softer instead of harder, and I let it, because this part of the story was not about volume. Every equation in this notebook is the foundation of the algorithm that global tech is licensing for $60 million a year. You planted that seed. You're the reason I could build anything at all. Wade's chin dropped. His hands, still flat on the table, began to tremble in a way that reminded me of my own hands on the bathroom floor the night before, a vibration that comes from somewhere deeper than muscle. But you never said any of it in front of her. I looked at Gretchen, then back at him. Not once. You gave me a secret language, and then pretended you didn't speak it. You taught me to build in the dark, and then you stood in the light and said nothing while she told everyone I was the slow one. I know, Wade said. 2 words. His eyes were wet, and his voice cracked on the second word, a sound like a beam, finally giving way after years of holding weight it was never rated for. Tatum looked at the notebook. I didn't know about this, she said, and it was the first sentence she'd spoken all evening that hadn't been drafted by our mother. The room held its breath. The grandfather clock ticked. Tatum lifted her head and looked at the notebook, then at Wade, then at me, and something passed across her face that I had never seen there before, something that was not competition or pity or the polished blankness she usually wore in this house. It looked like recognition, as if she were seeing me for the first time, or seeing herself for the first time, and couldn't decide which was more disorienting. Gretchen reached for the prospectus, as if pulling it closer to her could restore the meeting's original architecture. We can discuss the trust situation later. The point is that Tatum needs help now, and you're in a position to provide it. That's what family does. Family also shows up to graduations, I said. Family also calls on birthdays. Family also puts photographs on the wall. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard in that dining room, louder than the clock, louder than every argument I'd overheard through the basement ceiling as a teenager. Gretchen's hands lay flat on the table beside the prospectus, and she stared at me with an expression I could not decode, something between fury and the faintest edge of something that might have been shame, though I would not have bet money on it. I closed the notebook, slid the NDA back into my folder, left the prospectus where Gretchen had placed it, untouched, its spiral binding catching the overhead light. I'm not going to invest in Tatum's company, I said. I'm not going to fund this family's image
During
of
their
itself.
courtship,
You
watched
spent
her
10
die
years pretending I didn't exist, and then a journalist wrote an article, and suddenly I was worth a phone call
there was
and
the
a pot roast
sapphire
dinner.
engagement ring.
If any of you want a
you
relationship
don't have to
with
do
me,
this tomorrow.
a real one,
heart
you know where I am.
Yes,
But it starts with honesty.
and
Not
never
a
spoken of
prospectus.
once. I saved the
stood
call
up,
with my
took
family
my
Bible
bag,
from 19
at
at 11:18.
graduation
My mother
cap on the
left
table, next to the open
4 minute
notebook,
copper plate
and the
12 seconds.
untouched pot roast,
There was a recipe
and the
book
2
listed
documents
keeping
that told
since she
2
got
different
married.
stories about what this family was for. You can keep that, I said, looking at the cap. I don't need it anymore. Nobody followed me to the door. I passed the photo wall one more time on the way out. Tatum's Duke diploma, her wedding portrait, the marathon medal, the Christmas photo with my half-cropped face, and at the bottom, in a space I hadn't noticed before because I'd been looking at eye level and the space was near the baseboard, a small rectangular patch of paint that was slightly lighter than the rest of the wall, the size and shape of a frame that had once hung there and been removed. I didn't know what had been in it. I didn't stop to ask. The front door closed behind me with the soft click of a latch, not a slam, and I walked to the rental car in the dark. The Charlotte air was warm and thick, with the last of the magnolia season pressing against my skin. The porch light was on, casting a yellow circle on the front steps, and behind me I could hear the grandfather clock through the closed door, still ticking, still measuring time in a house where time had moved differently for each of us. For Tatum, it had been the accelerated clock of achievement and attention. For me, it had been the slow clock of waiting rooms and empty seats and silence that accumulated like interest on a debt nobody admitted they owed. I drove with no music, windows down. The humidity entered the car and sat in the passenger seat where the graduation cap had been that morning. The steering wheel was solid under my fingers, and I kept both hands on it, 10 and 2, the way my father had taught me in a church parking lot when I was 15, his voice calm and specific, hands at 10 and 2, eyes on the road, and if someone cuts you off, you let them go. I'd always been good at letting things go in traffic. In every other context, the skill had taken decades to develop. My phone buzzed on the a Charlotte number I didn't recognize.
I sat on the floor of my living room with my
green notebook was on the passenger seat.
I texted Sophia Francis in
where the
Greenville.
cap had been before
The call
that.
came from
The
Cassandra,
seating arrangement kept
my cousin,
changing, and I was the
21
one
at the
deciding
time,
what sat
a
beside
junior
me.
at Furman,
My phone
the
buzzed
only
twice
family member
more
who
before I
still
reached
talked
the
to me
highway
without
on-ramp.
permission.
I let
Her
both
mother,
calls go to voicemail.
my Aunt Mary Ann,
Whatever they had to
had
say
died of
could
breast
exist in a
cancer in
recording,
2019.
a format I could process on my
After
own
that,
schedule, neatly
in my own
labeled,
space,
chronologically
without the
ordered.
pressure of real-time
It held every
response.
invoice,
That was the
receipt,
lesson
and confirmation
dyslexia taught me
email
before I had
tied
language
to
for it.
Rachel's wedding.
Not every
It wasn't a
input needs
habit
to
of
be processed
paranoia.
at the
It was
speed
just
it
how
arrives.
Ethan did things.
Some data is better handled
The digital
asynchronously.
backups lived in his
Somewhere
cloud drive,
past the city limits,
but the paper
the
trail
street
brought a
lights
strange
dimmed,
sense
and the
of
road
grounding,
opened up,
concrete,
and the sky turned
tangible,
into the version of
proof
itself
that
he
only
flipped through the
exists
documents,
between pausing on the venue
dark
contract
and wide and
his name at the
generous,
top,
with
Ethan
a kind of
Miller,
light that
primary
takes
signer.
millions of years to arrive.
I drove the way I coded, in clean lines, compressing the excess, keeping only what was structurally necessary to hold the whole thing together. The highway stretched ahead, and behind me, Charlotte shrank to a glow on the horizon, the same way it had looked every time I'd driven away from it. Except this time, the rearview mirror showed a city I'd been honest in, and that changed the geometry of the departure. 4 months later, my office in Seattle still smelled like new carpet, and the espresso machine Rena had insisted I buy for the team after she visited once and declared the drip coffee an insult to consciousness. I'd hired 3 engineers, each of them quiet and precise, and the kind of person who communicated affection by fixing bugs in each other's code without being asked. We worked in a converted warehouse space south of Pioneer Square, where the ceilings were high enough to think in, and the rain on the windows sounded the same as it had in my apartment, except now it was background music for something I'd built with other people, which was a different frequency entirely. On the wall behind my desk, I'd framed the first page of the green notebook. Not the whole book, just the page with Wade's inscription and my 12-year-old attempt at diagramming data flow, the circles and arrows of a mind that was already building architecture before it had the vocabulary to name what it was doing. Visitors sometimes asked about it. I'd say it was the first draft. That was close enough to the truth, and the full truth was mine to keep. Tatum's consulting firm had folded 2 months after the dinner. She'd called me the week it happened, and my body braced for the familiar pattern: anger, a pitch, or the loaded silence that precedes a request for money. Instead, she asked me how I'd learned to code. "Dad taught me," I said. "Saturday mornings at a diner that's a nail salon now." He never told me that. He never told anyone.
Granny held his
That was
purple
sort of
hearts
the
in both
point.
hands. For
We
3
talked
days. They
for
were not
20
allowed
minutes.
in the room.
Then
She
it was
walked me
awkward.
into the hearing
full
room.
of
Was about
pauses
to
that
begin.
stretched too
16.
long,
The conference
and
room
sentences
used
that
6
started in the
people.
middle
And
and
she
went
on the
nowhere in
committee's down
particular.
a singer.
She told me she'd taken a job at a nonprofit in Durham,
Linwood.
something involving
Reed
grant
Larkin,
writing
this
for
is yours.
education
On the other
programs.
side, I'm telling your
She
mother.
said she liked that it had
I'm
nothing to
telling
do with
Laura
our
seated
parents'
behind her. Don't let anyone tell you
I
otherwise.
said that
A
was
camera on a
probably a good
tripod.
place to
That
start.
afternoon, she made a phone
laughed.
call.
Ingrid
Ingrid Shanberg sat against my back. I heard her say a name I did not
as if she'd
catch.
forgotten she could make it. We'd spoken 3 times since then. Not friendship, not yet, maybe not ever, but something newer and less decorated than what we'd had before, which had been nothing decorated as politeness. 3 phone calls without a script. 3 conversations where neither of us was performing for an audience of Gretchen. During the last call, She'd told me about a grant she was writing for a literacy program in rural North Carolina, and she'd paused and said, "I keep thinking about you," about how hard school must have been, with nobody catching the dyslexia. It was the first time anyone in my family had used the word. I'd said something neutral, something that kept the conversation moving without opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through yet. But the word sat in my chest for days afterward, a small, precise acknowledgement that arrived 20 years late and from a direction I hadn't expected. It was thin and new, and possibly temporary, and I was leaving it alone to see what it became without my interference. Some systems need time to stabilize before you start optimizing them. A package arrived at my office in early February, forwarded from my apartment. No return address, but the handwriting on the label was my father's, the same quick, small letters from the notebook inscription. Inside, wrapped in a piece of the Charlotte Observer from a Sunday I couldn't place, was a photograph I'd never seen. Wade and me, sitting at the diner booth on Breckenridge Street. I was 13 in the photo, my hair in a ponytail, my eyes on the laptop screen, my mouth slightly open the way it got when I was concentrating. He was leaning over my shoulder, pointing at something on the display with his index finger, his other hand wrapped around a coffee mug, both of us in the same world. On the back, in pencil, faded almost to invisibility, Saturday. He'd kept it in his wallet. That was what the crease mark said. Years of folding and unfolding at the center line, the paper soft and furred at the seams, worn thin at the corners where it pressed against credit cards and grocery receipts and whatever else a man carries in his back pocket through 10,000 days of ordinary life. The kind of damage that only happens to something a person carries everywhere without showing anyone. A private archive. A compressed file he never transmitted, but never deleted. No note came with it. Just the photo and the newspaper wrapping and a postmark from Charlotte. I sat at my desk for a long time after opening it, my coffee going cold the way coffee always goes cold around me, a pattern so consistent it might as well be a personal trait. The engineers were in the back room, their voices low and technical, the sound of people building something together, and the contrast between that sound and the silence in the photograph was something I could hold in both hands and not quite close my fingers around. Gretchen had posted something on Facebook around the same time, a quote, graphic about respecting everyone's journey in a font designed for people who confuse sentiment with change. No direct contact with me. No phone call. No letter. Aunt Carol had liked the post. Rena screenshotted it and texted it to me with no comment except a single period, which was Rena's way of saying everything and nothing simultaneously. The photo wall in my parents' hallway, according to a mutual acquaintance Rena had run into at a Charlotte fundraiser, apparently had a new frame on it. Small, positioned near the bottom. The acquaintance hadn't gotten close enough to see what was in it. Neither had I. And whether it contained my face or just another of Tatum's accomplishments or something else entirely was a question I was choosing, for now, to leave unanswered. The graduation cap lived on a hook by my front door, next to my rain jacket, and an umbrella I'd owned for 2 years and never opened. Not a trophy, not a symbol. Just a hat I'd finally worn, the tassels swinging when I brushed past it on my way out in the mornings, counting time in a language only I could read. I held Wade's photograph at my desk on a Tuesday afternoon while the servers hummed in the back room and the rain worked the windows, and my 3 engineers argued quietly about database indexing in a way that meant they were happy. The crease down the middle of the photo had split his shoulder from mine, a clean fold through the center of the frame, and I ran my thumb along it, feeling the texture of years compressed into paper. Part of me still checked. Every time my phone buzzed, there was a half second where the signal reached my brain before the rational processing caught up. And in that half second, I hoped it was my mother calling to say something real. Not the Facebook version of Pride, not the hostess voice, just my name, without a request attached to it. A greeting that meant, I see you instead of I need you. I did not think that reflex would go away completely. You learn to live inside the half second, register the input, and then let the processing layer do its work. Acknowledge the signal, discard the false pattern. continue execution. What I'd built was never about the money, though the money was real, and the brokerage statements were proof that competence has a market value even when your family doesn't assign you one. What I built was a language. When the one everyone used kept betraying me, when the letters on the page scrambled and rearranged themselves, and my mouth couldn't form the words fast enough to match the speed of my thinking, I found a different system. A system where precision was possible, where you could take a mess of unstructured data, identify the redundancy, strip the noise, and compress it into something clean and functional and true. Code stayed where I put it. It executed what I told it to execute. And when it broke, the error messages told me exactly where the fault was and why, which was more than anyone in that dining room had ever done. My father gave me the notebook. My mother gave me the reason to fill it. Neither of them intended to create what they created, which was a person who could sit at their table, wear the cap they never came to see, and tell the truth without needing them to agree with it. The gift and the wound arrived from the same house, through the same hallway, past the same wall that had never displayed my face. Whether Wade ever hung that photograph in the hallway remained an open question. Whether the answer mattered was its own uncertainty, the kind you learn to carry the way you carry a key to a door you might not ever open. Some questions are more useful in their asking than in their answering. A door left ajar lets in more light than one thrown wide. I set the photo on my desk, next to the framed notebook page. 2 things my father gave me, one with words and one without, both carrying the same message in different compression formats. My laptop held a new data set, a new problem, a new architecture waiting to be built from the ground up. The cursor blinked on the empty screen, patient and unhurried, asking nothing except what I was ready to give it. I started typing.